In this video we are going to discuss layout. Layout is important because that's how you build a website or a web application. If you can't define what goes where, how are you going to build your application? So to start off with, we need to consider the fact that there's HTML and there's CSS. HTML defines the content of the page or the document. The CSS defines how that content is displayed, right? So there are two main containers in HTML. One is called div. We'll just add the word div there, and I'll add 3 divs. And I can see that without adding any styling, a div displays one above the other. The reason for that is because a div has a default CSS display of block, and this is the default behavior of how block works. The other default container that there is span. So when I add a bunch of spans together, I can see that they don't actually render top down, they display from left to right. Why? Because the display is set to inline. So the language itself gives you this idea of what these things should be. This works like a block. This works inline. It's important to note that this is how the behavior is on the container itself. It doesn't actually affect the content inside of it. But very often when I have a container with children in it, I want to be able to manipulate how the children is laid out within that container. So let's quickly have a look at that. So let's say I have a div here, and inside of this div I got a whole bunch of other divs. Let's just make it like div 1, 2, and 3. Maybe a fourth one would be good just for balance. Alright, so this container we'll call test, and then we're going to add some style sheets to this, right? So style Alright, so now note that this default behavior of these divs is still block. But I can go to test now and say your display is flex. And I've done nothing else to it. I've just changed the container type. So now the display is flex, which affects how the layout is done. Flex is two-dimensional layout, top down, left to right. So I can do that by saying that my flex direction is row, which is what the default is, or I can say it's column, and now it shows top down. But note how it's either left to right or top down, but I can do more stuff with this. I can, for argument's sake, say I want this to be in reverse. So now the first item is showed last and the last item is showed first. Have I made any HTML changes to facilitate that? No. The document content is still the same, but I've used CSS to change how that content is laid out, right? Another thing I can do here is to say, okay, well that's great, but I want to have more flexibility around this. So I can make this a grid. So grids have columns and rows, so I can say that my template grid columns is 1FR 1FR, which means that it's going to take the space of the container, which would be this guy, and I want to divide the space up between two columns equally. And now you can see that the first div is in the first row, first column. The second div is in the first row, the second column, and it auto wraps my next item to the next row. So a grid provides you with more two-dimensional functionality where I can have both rows and columns where the flexbox is either a row or a column. And the big difference between the div and the span versus flexbox and grid is that the div and the span is the default behavior of the container itself, right? So if I just copy and paste this, what I expect to see is two grids, one above the other. So let's just give this thing a bit of some styling. We'll say border is solid 1 pixel silver. Well, background silver, margin 10 pixels. Okay, just to show you that it is two separate items. Now, what would happen if I make this a span? So span, 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 span. Nothing. Why? Because I've changed the behavior. The default display of a span is inline, but it's not inline anymore. It's now grid, and grid behaves more like a block. So it doesn't make sense to use span in this case because I've overwritten the inline display of the span. So I might as well just leave this additive. Alright, so quick summary. A div has a default behavior of block, which makes it display top down. Span has a default display of inline, which makes it show from right to left. And it only affects the container itself, not the content. However, if I want to change the layout of the content, I can either use the display of flex, which will give me either layout columns or layout rows, or I can change it to display grid, which will give me columns and rows. All right.